Hello everyone, and welcome to this latest video discussion as part of the RICS Tech Partner Programme. My name is Andrew Knight and I've been with RICS for over 11 years now, and I work within our standards, thought leadership and regulatory part of the organisation. My role is to look at the effect of data and technology right across the built and natural environment, and with over 110,000 qualified members and additional student members working right across the globe, right across the property life cycle through land, planning and development, construction, valuation, finance, building operations, brokerage. There's an incredibly wide palette upon which data and tech is having a revolutionary effect on the way we deal with built assets. And indeed, our members are working across residential, commercial, infrastructure, alternative assets. So a really, really broad palette, as I say, in which data and tech is having a very, very positive effect and indeed changing the way our profession's working. And I'm really glad today to have Gavriel join me from REalyse. So please join me, Gavriel.
Hello.
Hi, great to have you on the discussion today. Now, before we get into the depths of bits and bytes and what you're doing at REalyse, it's always great to have a bit of a kind of a human interest piece. So it'd be great to hear a bit about your background and your colleagues and a bit of an origin story of REalyse, if I may.
Yeah, sure. I kind of feel like I need to get Marvel to do different no superpowers, unfortunately. So yeah, my own background, I started off working in the financial sector actually, and then decided that looking at little lines going up and down on a screen wasn't quite as fulfilling as I thought it would be, and went and worked at a very large property development company instead. It was a big transition, and I found it absolutely amazing going out there with a hard hat on and going and standing on buildings that were part complete and going, wow, okay, I've only ever seen this thing on a spreadsheet, but now it's real. Really, really exciting, really cool. And then seeing these projects evolve and then go live, and people using them in whether it's commercial, retail, residential, whatever it was. But then through that process, that kind of transition from one industry to another, it surprised me how in the real estate world people weren't really taking full advantage of data, really, in the way that we had been doing for a long time in financial services. And that sort of sparked off the question in my mind of like, okay, well, why not? What can be done about this? What could make my own life easier to begin with? Just getting more information that I can put into my spreadsheets to make better viability models and appraisals. And I started putting something together in one of the companies where I was working to try and pull together some data. And it sort of grew and evolved, and then started putting some maps in it. It started off just a big spreadsheet, and then that evolved, and I thought, well, hold on a minute, there might be other people that might need this as well. Oh, maybe I'll go and try and sell this to other people. So that kick-started what became REalyse. At the time when I first launched it, it was called Insight Residential. That was the very first thing. Yeah. And then here we are.
Indeed. So, I mean, how would you summarize, what does REalyse do in a relatively short number of sentences?
It's always a tricky one. So we brought together a vast amount of information about the UK property market. So rents, prices, yields, planning applications, construction pipeline, asset ownership information, demographics, points of interest, and lots of other things. About 700 or 800 different data sets. And we provide that to different companies in the lending space, in the development space, investment, asset management, land finding, anyone that's really got an interest in residential real estate at a professional level. And they use the system for valuations, for land finding, for identifying new areas of opportunity, for benchmarking their performance. There's probably a few dozen different ways that people use the system. In fact, there's some unusual use cases we've come across as well. But those are the core ones. Valuation
and given how fragmented, property data is, without getting deeply into the bits and bytes, how do you actually manage to achieve that? Because I guess you're putting together lots and lots of different data sets. So there must be quite some big technological challenges, as well as kind of data cleansing and reformatting to make that happen. So give us a flavor of what's underneath the hood, as it were.
Yeah, that's an enormous amount of work. I often say to people that we're almost two companies in one. We've got a whole data aggregation and cleaning business on one side, and a data visualization business on the other. There's about 70 or so different sources that we work with, which ranges from public access government data through to web scrape data, private data agreements, exclusive data agreements, and our own proprietary information as well. But the principle that we take is that with each new data set, wherever it's coming from, once it's satisfied the criteria of being robust and accurate and timely and that sort of stuff, is we think about how would someone who is working in one of our client companies, be that an investor or a developer, whoever it is, how would they look at this data and how would they use it and how would they think about it? So if you take a simple thing like a spreadsheet, maybe from a government website that says like average income in Yorkshire, and it shows you year on year, but then in 2020 there's no number because no one collected the data in 2020. So you and I would probably look at that spreadsheet and think, well, okay, rather than having an X in 2020, what was the 2019 value and what was the 2021 value? And it's probably halfway between the two. So, simple example like that, you then, I don't anymore, but someone else writes some code that then actually interpolates the difference between the two and then sets up the automatic data collection, pipelining, and joining it with the other data sets. But there is a lot of work that goes into it.
Indeed, and I suppose that's always the, when I say illusion, it's that sort of magic that's happening underneath that bonnet that says actually eventually you end up with a very powerful set of data points, but actually the raw material probably needed a fair amount of refining, almost to use the kind of oil analogy in terms of turning it into that quality. Now, you alluded to sort of some of the kind of use cases, and as you said, some of the more unusual ones. Could you perhaps give a bit more depth about how people are using these data sets in real world situations?
Well, I mean, the most common one is really around valuation and identifying opportunities. So the system that we've got, I'll show it to you in a second, my 2 seconds, will allow you to see very quickly where there are things like high-priced areas and low-priced areas, or a piece of land that falls under a particular regulation or doesn't, and therefore is more available to be built on. There are, I'm trying to think of sort of some of the more unusual use cases. There's been some marketing use cases we've used it for. There was one particular use case with a local authority that was looking at, what was it? It was to do with, this is really sort of stretching it. It was to understand where it was that they would be able to house people that were on housing lists, but then they had to understand the particular needs of those individuals, be they sort of hospital requirements, religious requirements, etc., that then factored into the local area, which they were then able to do using our system by saying, okay, well, we as a local authority can afford this amount of rent, this is our cap, these are the areas that match, right? Now, these are the ones that have, the relevant things that this person requires. Okay, can we actually find some housing for them in that location? Which I thought was quite an interesting one.
Yeah, and in some respects, it's just a kind of a reframing of probably quite a lot of use cases where people are looking for a certain set of criteria that match whatever their particular agenda is in terms of a development. And I suppose that's just an unusual one in terms of some of the criteria. So thinking of the RICS profession in terms of, our planners and developers and valuers, how are you seeing the kind of REalyse platform being used by RICS members, particularly surveyors, to use the phrase?
I'll show you. Let me see if I can actually get my screen to share, and hopefully.
Yeah, there we go.
This was actually, I think I'm looking at Hartford because I was actually looking because my dad is selling his house there and was asking me what do you think it's worth. And although I am not qualified to give valuation advice. But let's say that you were interested in Hartford, you could go on here and draw a circle around this area. Let's say you think half a mile is relevant, but you could draw a square around the street. You can combine different shapes. You can postcode, local authority, whatever it is. And now let's say that we want to see, okay, well, something relatively simple like the sold pound per square foot values in that area without any particular filters on property types. Hit apply. It thinks about it for a second, and then we've got this little chart here that pops up here, and so okay, the The median is £485 per square foot, but we can go and see, okay, what's the top, sorry, that's the bottom, the top quartile doing, top quartiles of 550, what's the top decile, 600. So, if you're building something new there that is particularly high end, you're going to be more interested in that one. You can look at things like, okay, well, how long is it likely to take you to sell that particular property, whereas days on market. There it is. And we do the same thing for rents. One of the really interesting things that we've got is we have the largest achieved rent data set in the UK. So we can actually see not only what something was put on the market for, but actually what was the rent charge. So days on market it's about 60 days, so about 2 months, pretty good. But there are some outliers there because we've kept that top 90th percentile on that's 185 days, so up to 6 months. Then planning data. This is where you start getting a map that gets loaded up with all kinds of different things going on. We can see all of the planning applications that are being put through, and then also who's involved with those applications. So particularly if you're valuing an existing building, you would want to know, is somebody about to go and build a great big tower right next to it or something like that. So you can see here, there's a nice pink dot there that is a particular development that's going to be going on. And if I was looking at a property, valuing a property right next to it, I would think, okay, I need to consider how that might impact things. And there's, like I said, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different data sets in here. So you can layer them up in all kinds of different ways.
Fascinating. So in terms of, you've been doing this quite a few years now, what do you think in the near term, in the short term, will be the effects of data and technology like this? Presumably you've seen a fair amount of change in the years you've been going, but either through perhaps some of the effects of the pandemic and the way the market's behaving, but what are you seeing still about data and technology that's bringing continued change and that we're going to see perhaps in the next year, 18 months or so?
The change that I've seen has been quite astounding, quite incredible, actually. I think even I, and I think others, often gave the real estate industry a bit of a beating, let's say, in terms of technology fast enough, etc., etc. But if I think about it, 6 years ago when we started, no one was really talking about using big data analytics systems or something like that. That as a bit of a mouthful to say. Some people sort of looking like, what are you talking about? But now, 6 years is not that long, really. I've worked on development projects that were more than twice that time. In that time span, I would say almost everyone is using some form of data system in order to understand more about, obviously, okay, we're dealing with market data and asset data, but there's lots of data as well. But to understand more about what is going on out there in the world with particular buildings, with other companies, with the general environment. And I think it's a double-edged sword. It's an interesting one because it gives you a whole range of extra capacity and capability and insight, but only for a certain amount of time, because then everyone catches up, but then you need to get on to the next thing, right? It's like every time they release a new iPhone, you have to go get the new one because it's got some sort of fancy new capabilities. I just see it going, faster and faster and smoother, hopefully.
So I mean, in the long term, if I asked you to get your the cliche, your crystal ball out, where do you see this coming to in perhaps 4 or 5 years in terms of either additional data sets or perhaps the ability for systems to perhaps do even more predictive work and perhaps actually take some of even more of the kind of work away from people to let them focus on some of the higher value stuff, because there's probably still a lot of kind of almost manual thinking that's going on. So do you see trends in that direction where there'll be even more automation and more data sets to help people make decisions almost with, as I say, with even less intervention by a human?
Yeah, absolutely. Thinking about our own journey, when I've said that we're almost 2 businesses in one, you've got a data aggregation side and a visualization side. This was work that individuals were previously doing. You would have to go out and get that data yourself, and you would have to clean it up, and you would have to put it into Excel and make a nice chart out of it, and then put it into a presentation to then impact decision makers about taking a particular course of action. Now we've kind of handled that data processing and visualization piece. It's still up to the individual to then, interpret it, make the convincing argument, understand the nuances, etc. However, undoubtedly, and we're doing it, and I'm sure others are, looking more, okay, well, we have this information now, how can we help improve decision making itself? What kind of insights can we give? Can we give some kind of a reasonably reliable forecast of what might be around the corner or what's likely to happen in the near term, that then saves that person, again, spending the time themselves sitting there trying to figure out, okay, well, there's this amount of planning applications that are going on, therefore I think the construction pipeline in 2 years' time might be this. That's the kind of thing that we can relatively near term start to look at, and those kind of improvements will just consistently come out over time. So it might be that in 4 or 5 years' time, we might already be looking at a almost radically different approach to how people are going about the daily business within real estate, using all of these different systems and technologies. At least, obviously, as a technologist, I hope so.
Now, it's an interesting question, I think, from my perspective and our perspective at RICS, that, essentially as a standard setter and a regulator, how do you see standards, and not just from us, but perhaps other organizations, fitting into this increasingly automated, data-driven world? Because clearly, we have a public interest mandate. We're making sure that the end users, whether it's valuation or developers or planning consultants, that service is provided and it's transparent to the marketplace. And I guess there's perhaps not so much attention, but an alignment there to make sure that as we automate, as decisions perhaps are almost served up to us by systems, how does standards interrelate with that? Have you got any thoughts on that? How standards sit in line when it's about quality of data, provenance of data? If people are using algorithms to make decisions like an AVM, how do standards relate to that kind of landscape?
Yeah, I think they're absolutely essential, but it's a very tricky one to manage, right? Because the technology itself can be so diverse and adapting so quickly that trying to put standards in a way that perhaps limits the market or limits the opportunities and things that could be available. And so it is definitely a difficult one, but you also need to have those standards so that end users, consumers, companies, etc., of data and technology products such as ours can have some level of assurance that the thing is going to work and is doing the right job and is doing it the right kind of way. Even a toaster has I think it's a steam.
Yes, exactly.
It's not going to blow up and burn down your house, or at least it shouldn't. And so in the same sense, data companies, I think, also need to have a set of standards. Of this organization is producing information, is producing products that adhere to these kind of guidelines about the quality, the consistency, the methodology, that kind of thing, without perhaps being prescriptive of this is the methodology that it has to be, because there are many different ways to do things. Indeed.
I mean, do you almost get that kind of questioning from clients in terms of them wanting to understand, provenance of data, that those kind of questions that they're seeking to assure themselves that, you've almost got your own standards, your own QA, quality assurance, arguably about how you actually get data, how you're clear about the methodology of how it was collected, its recency, all those sort of things. Is that something you're already probably having a dialogue with people around?
Yes, totally. Although a little bit less so recently, I think, as we've become more established and trusted and people have gotten used to what we're doing, there's been more of a sort of sense of, okay, well, it does work. But certainly very early on, a very frequent question I would get is, how accurate is it? They say, well, accurate in compared to what? What's the benchmark? There is no benchmark. Which is really tricky. And then when you do get questions around provenance of data, how is something calculated, interpreted, and you're trying to explain how thousands of lines of code and some little bits of AI floating in the middle have generated a particular output, it can get quite tricky actually to to get to an answer that is either coherent or doesn't sound like you're avoiding it.
No, and as you say, I think from a standards perspective, we need to be thinking about general principles rather than being too prescriptive, because, you know, as you say, we can't dictate what kind of algorithms you use or a particular approach, but it's probably more about general principles of transparency and understanding provenance of data, and giving people some sense of how you either calibrate or backtest or do those kind of things to make sure that, as you would want to do, that you think you're producing sensible answers. I guess I wanted to move on almost to a slightly different topic, which is, given you have such a rich set of data, both in terms of rental and capital values, what have you been seeing in the market? And I guess it's become a cliche to talk about the effects of the pandemic and buying behaviour, but what are you seeing in the UK market in terms of perhaps short-term trends in terms of what's happening in both rental and capital, capital purchases?
Yeah. It's, I mean, okay, I suppose the pandemic impact has been talked about. Everyone rippled out of cities and then has rippled back in again. And then you obviously had the impact of lots and lots of money and therefore prices going up. And now you're starting to see the impact of increasing interest rates. And I don't think there's been I don't get the sense yet, at least from the data that we're seeing, there's been any sort of huge impact, but there seems to be a bit more of a hesitancy for sort of home buyers at the moment. What we are seeing is a bit of a divergence going on between the number of listings coming onto the market relative to the number of transactions. So there are more properties coming onto the market and fewer being sold, which obviously implies that either people are holding off or they aren't able to get mortgages or something like that. I think it's probably the former as opposed to the latter. I think people are probably looking and going, okay, well, maybe I'll just keep renting for another 3 months, see how things pan out over the summer, and then make a decision.
I mean, in terms of sort of broader, sort of medium-term trends, as you mentioned, that was that kind of move out of cities and to an extent a move back. And obviously, it's yet another cliche that there is so much working from home now. Do you think, from a kind of structural mid-term perspective, that we are looking at a different kind of footprint of where people are going to be buying and renting? And those trends around more space to make sure you've got a home office and having an outside space, do you see those as permanent? And perhaps leaving aside the monetary effects of kind of rising interest rates and overall affordability, given the rise of institutional build to rent, do you see some kind of midterm structural shifts that will be permanent, as opposed to perhaps some of the shorter term effects of the pandemic?
Yeah, so it reminds me of in 2019, I think it was sort of, must have been Q3, I was having a chat with one of our software developers at the time, and we were theorizing about the future of the office, and sort of conclusion that you give it 5 years, and the level of video quality and data displays and 5G and this, that, and the other will mean that actually you won't really need to go to the office. There'll be much more working from home, and therefore, as a result, we were thinking, okay, well, what would the impact then be on the property market, given that we primarily deal with residential property? Then lo and behold, 6 months later, everyone was working from home and using video calls, and data systems like ours became more popular than ever. I think that there is definitely a long-term impact. I don't think it should be overstated in terms of, I don't think it's quite at the point where all offices disappear and we're all working from home all the time, although obviously you and I are right now.
Yeah, as we speak, yeah.
We both have offices, and I'm sure I go to mine sometimes, I'm sure you go to yours sometimes. But I think that does change what people are looking for. We did see and continue to see premiums being paid for additional space, whether that's being rented space or people actually buying a property, wanting to have that home office or that extra bedroom or whatever it is that they can use when they are working from home. And I think that will certainly persist. I think that will last, definitely. It does mean that when you're looking at places to live, the idea of the sort of the commuter town or commuter village changes somewhat, in that in those areas, perhaps it used to be that you go there to sleep, and in the daytime you go to work, and on the weekends you're there, and that's it. Whereas now, actually, probably a larger proportion of the population that normally just sleeps there is also there during the day, and therefore they might actually want a retail offering. They might want to go for a haircut, whereas previously, they'd get the train into the nearby city and they would get it done there. So I think that creates some really interesting opportunities across the market. And then in the build to rent space, as you've mentioned, that's one of our strongest segments on the basis of all the sort of demographic and rental data that we've got. It's still relatively new in the UK. The proportion of assets is still relatively small. I was looking at statistics the other day, and it's expected to grow, I think, 35% a year on year for the next, I think it was until 2030, so for the next 8 years, which is a massive amount of growth. And that definitely fills an interesting niche, because previously, if you wanted to rent, well, you were basically renting properties that were built with the intention to sell them, and somebody at some point bought it and is then renting it on to you. It wasn't the purpose-built stock that was designed just for being rented, or being a blend of rented and individual owners. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there, particularly when you're looking at these big companies that have huge amounts of investment capital available to them and can look nationwide, across the UK at different opportunities to say, okay, well, actually, I'm making it up, but let's say, a particular area of Sheffield, another bit of Bristol, these areas have got great demographic profiles, rental yields, etc. They can then go and deploy significant amounts of money, go and build 50, 100, 200 units, have them up and running in a couple of years' time, and create a nice stabilized income for somebody's pension fund, basically.
Well, indeed, yes, you said that kind of maturity matching approach, which I think they're often looking for. I mean, just one last question on kind of trends, and once again, it becomes a bit of a cliche to ask it, but obviously for sort of new builds, people are building sustainability in from the ground up, but for existing assets, are you getting an increasing demand for that kind of sustainability data? And obviously there's EPC out there, but obviously people are looking for more depth, I guess, around that as well.
Yes, it's a sort of, I feel like it's a bit of a nebulous concept at the moment. Everyone's looking for something, but not quite sure what it is that they're looking for yet, and it will sort of emerge one way or the other. The EPCs have been a really great standard to start from, and even though it was I think it was a European directive, as far as I can tell from looking at other countries, the UK seems to have done almost more than anybody else in terms of making that information available and making sure there's lots of detail to it. You try and get an EPC for a property in Germany, I wasn't able to do it. I don't know if somebody else can. So that's been really, really very impressive. One of the things that I think the market's starting to think about is the changes with what you will be allowed to rent, given its level of energy efficiency, and how that is going to impact the market. I was talking to someone the other day who said that they thought that this would then cause a whole bunch of people to be selling properties in the next couple of years that have low energy ratings, in order to get them off their hands. But then, I was wondering, okay, well, if they're selling them, who's going to be buying them, and why are they going to be buying them? Is it to try and bring them up to a higher standard, or what would somebody do with that? Presumably, that's the only thing you can do, right? Is to get it and then put the insulation in, the double glazing, whatever it is. I guess you run into trouble if you're, it's a listed property or something like that. I don't know if you've got some special exemption. Don't know if Buckingham Palace is going to have to put double glazing.
Yeah, you probably have to check your Article 4 direction if you're in a conservation area and ask for permission to put them in. But that's the joys of the details of planning and restrictions, isn't it?
Yeah. Never been my strong suit, I have to admit.
Well, it's been fascinating to talk, and I'd love to catch up with you again and talk in a bit more depth, Gavriel, when we've got some time over the next couple of months. But for the moment, thanks very much. I guess if people want to get in touch and find out a bit more, just go to the website and they can get your details and do a demo, presumably. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, just go to REalyse.com or track me down on LinkedIn.
Indeed. Well, thanks for today, and I look forward to having another conversation in the not too distant future, Gavriel.
Likewise. Thanks, Andrew.